Hello colleagues, and welcome to Week 1, Unit 4 of SAP Cloud Platform Version Control with Git. In this unit, we will discuss how to create and connect orphaned repositories. Sometimes you just want to start development. Maybe you want to experiment with UI5 development in the Web IDE to prototype what's possible. So let's say you do this. You start creating a UI5 project and you completely ignore Git, just creating a local project and adding features as you see fit. What sometimes happens is that what started as a prototype may actually wind up as a pretty good starting point for your team's development. In this scenario, you may wish you were working with a Git repository so that you could use Git to collaborate with your colleagues. It turns out, using Web IDE, you can create a repository from a pre-existing project. This unit will show you how. Here's the basic process. You start by creating a project or just a set of files in Web IDE. This could take 10 seconds if it's just a few files, or it could take a few weeks if you work on your own personal full-blown development project without the benefit of version control. Next, you use Web IDE to transform your files into a local Git repository. I should mention that you could do this right away. You could create a local Git repository as soon as you create the files without ever having the intention of sharing that repository with anyone else. The advantage would be that you could have all the advantages of local version control, which might make your development process easier. Then you will create an empty GitHub repository. And of course, this could work with a home for your remote repository other than GitHub. Now, you can actually assign the empty GitHub repository as your remote origin repository, even though your local repository was there first. Now you've assigned it as a remote. Finally, you push your code to the origin repository so that the two are in sync. Now, at the beginning of the course, I mentioned more than once that I am strongly recommending that all class participants follow along with the demos that I'm creating in this course. That being said, this particular demo is the only one, with the exception of the bonus lectures in week 4, that I'm going to encourage you not to follow along with. You can, but the reason is that even though this demo is one of the 3 basic cloning strategies, there's some steps here that if you're brand new to Git, might not make any sense until you get to week 2 or even week 3. For quizzes and assignments, all you need to know is that this strategy is possible. You don't need to start with a remote repository that you clone. You can just start using Git directly in the Web IDE and worry about sharing your work later. On the other hand, if you have some Git experience already and you're quite comfortable with the concept of fetching and rebasing and pushing, then I encourage you to follow along. Otherwise, this demo is here for you to go back and reference later, either following along with at the end of the course once you've learned everything, or you could just go back and reference this demo in case you ever want to create a Git repository directly in the Web IDE and hook it into a remote repository after the fact. So let's get to the demo. We're going to go to Web IDE, and let's just create a folder. We're pretending that we are doing a personal development experiment. So let's create a folder to hold our new prototype. We'll call it personal prototype. By the way, notice that this doesn't have the green dot or the plus sign. Plus sign means that your changes are a little out of sync with the remote repository, and the plus sign indicates that everything's in sync. It doesn't have any of those symbols because this is not a Git repository. So it's just files. So that's you notice a difference right there. So let's create a file. I'm just going to copy and paste some contents of a file I've pre-prepared to save us a little time. Now, here's a good time to mention, I may mention this again, that in this course, I've chosen, I didn't want to require UI5 knowledge or any other language. And I also didn't want to make the demos happen with just plain text files, because that is maybe a little too simplistic. Plus, there's nothing for you to test in Web IDE. So for these demos, I'm going to be creating simple web pages. That way, and the HTML will be so simple that you really don't have to have any experience in JavaScript or HTML if you're learning Git before you learn those things. But that way, you can do things like hit this run button and test that you have a working web page. Here we go. And you can see what I've typed in here. And so now we have, let's say this is our prototype. It could be much more complex. It could be a UI5 project. But at this point, it's just a bunch of files. So let's say we want it to become a Git repository. We may not even be sure that we want to share it with anyone at this point, but we want to use version control for our prototype. So I right-clicked the folder. I'm choosing Git, and I'm choosing Initialize Local Repository. Now we have a Git repository. See, the symbol here changed a bit. You have all the power of Git that we will cover throughout this course available at your fingertips, even though you don't have a remote repository yet. So at this point, let's say you've worked on your prototype a while and you feel pretty good about it, and you choose to hook this into a GitHub repository. So let's go to GitHub now. You want to share this. So once again, we're at GitHub, and let's go to the New Repository button. And we will call this whatever you want to call it, actually. But let's say it's now a project for the whole team. So we'll call it prototype_project. You could call it whatever you want. My prototype that the entire team will now collaborate on. Whatever you want to call it. Once again, we are going to make it public, and we are going to initialize this repository with a README. So I'm going to click Create Repository. Now, let's go to the Clone or Download button and click this Copy to Clipboard again. So now we have the URL for this empty repository hiding in our clipboard. So now let's go to the project settings here. I want to show you something. Remember earlier we showed in the project settings that the copied repository was aware of the parent repository it had been cloned from. Let's look at those project settings now. This origin setting in the Git repository configuration doesn't exist because there is no origin. This is just a orphaned repository. It's a Git repository all off on its own. So that setting doesn't exist. So let's do something here. Let's go to this personal prototype, right-click it, and we'll say Git, waiting for the menu path to come. And there's this option here of Set Remote. Let's do that. The name is origin. That works perfect. And let's put in the URL of the GitHub repository that we copied earlier. Let's hit OK. Okay, now at this point, you will need to use not your SAP Cloud Platform username and login, but your GitHub username and login for authentication. Okay, it says changes fetched. Okay. Now, we've assigned a remote. So these two things, these two repositories are communicating to each other. Now, this repository believes it is the child of the empty GitHub repository. But they're not in sync. If you remember, here we have a readme.md file. Here we have no such file. Here we have an index.html file, and here we have no such file. So this is the part that we're going to cover more specifically what we're doing later on. But for now, let's go ahead and fetch. I think it's already done a fetch, but we'll do it again to get our latest. And if these steps don't make sense to you now, they will later, but we're going to hit rebase. And we're going to rebase on top of origin slash master in order to get things in sync. Oh, uncommitted changes. Ha! I need to commit my index.html. So initial creation of empty web page. I'm going to commit these things. Make sure that both of these checkboxes are checked before you type in a commit message here and hit commit. Okay, that's done. Now I'm going to hit rebase. I'm going to rebase on top of origin slash master. Now look, we're almost there because this readme.md file did not exist before, as it did here. But this index.html file, which is in this project, is not here. So one more step. We're going to push to origin slash master. And the push has been completed. We see that little message here. I'm going to refresh this page. And aha, we have our index.html file now here on GitHub. Okay. At this point, your local repository believes that the repository on GitHub is its origin, even though your local repository was created first. So now you know, and you have a demo for how to start development directly in Web IDE, then turn your development into a Git repository after the fact, and finally, how to connect that local orphaned Git repository to a remote repository as its origin, even though your local repository was created first. I invite you to join me in the next unit where we will move into a lower gear and talk about the staging area and how Git knows which changes you want to be tracked in which versions.